Howdy folks, and welcome to the Hillbilly Kitchen. Today we're going to be making old-fashioned buttermilk biscuits. Now we have up a couple biscuit recipes. We have up a healthy biscuit recipe and a basic butter biscuit. But I wanted to dress these up a little bit today. And I also wanted to do a video because several people have messaged me and told me that they cannot get self-rising flour where they are. Well, it's really simple to convert all-purpose flour to self-rising flour, which is basically what I'm doing in this recipe. I have 2 cups of all-purpose flour, a tablespoon of baking powder, and I'm going to go ahead and dump that in there, and a half a teaspoon of salt. And if you want to make biscuits and your biscuit recipe calls for self-rising and all you have is all-purpose, that's literally all you do. I have 1/3 of a cup of butter, and because these are buttermilk biscuits, I have 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk, and this is whole buttermilk. I do not recommend using skim buttermilk in these, because the whole buttermilk is going to give you that texture that you want. And buttermilk biscuits do have a slightly different texture than regular biscuits. If you use the skim though, you're not really going to get that. And I also in these have about 2.5 tablespoons of honey. I didn't measure this exactly, and you don't have to be exact with it, but about 2 tablespoons is probably enough. And this is entirely optional. But if you're going to be making these to go with like a big fried chicken Sunday dinner or something, the honey is really nice in it. It sweetens them just a little bit, but not too much. They're more like, you know, a dinner roll usually. It's just a little bit sweet, and that's what the honey does to your biscuit. Now, they're also good for breakfast with the honey in them, but I don't usually do that when I'm making them for breakfast. And of course, we need a little extra flour for when we get ready to roll them out. But I'm going to dump my flour and my baking powder and my salt in here. And I'm just going to whisk this a little bit. You can sift it if you want to, but when you start mixing the butter in, you're going to kind of pack it back down anyway. And in my opinion, the difference in texture that you would get from sifting it is just not worth the mess that it makes to sift it. So I do hit it a little bit with the whisk first, which puts a little air in it, similar to what sifting it would do. And a lot of people too, they take their butter out of the fridge, or some people even freeze it. This is at room temperature, and in my opinion, if you have it really cold, you're just making life hard on yourself. I always do mine at room temperature, and it's fine. It will make your dough a little bit softer, but I really think the softer dough gives your biscuits a better texture. So I like my butter at room temperature. And again, this is just 1/3 of a cup. Just dump that in, and you're going to cut it in. You can use a dough blade if you have one. I always use a whisk. And you do have to kind of be careful because the butter will get stuck in your whisk and you'll have to tap it out a little bit. But if you start kind of light like this and you don't try and get the whole chunk of butter in there at one time, it comes through your whisk a little bit easier when you do have to start tapping it to get it out of there. I used to have a dough blade and it broke, and I just never bothered to replace it because the whisk works just fine. And it's just another gadget in the kitchen drawer. And you want to keep mixing this until you get that butter all mixed in there good and there's no big chunks left. Because once you add your milk, you want to work the dough as little as possible. The more you work the dough after you add the milk, the tougher your biscuits will be. And if you work it too much, your biscuits will come out like little hockey pucks. If you've got a big food processor, you can mix this in a food processor. And I suppose it would probably mix okay in my stand mixer. I don't think I would use a hand mixer to do this. You're just looking for a mess in the kitchen. But if you soften the butter first, it's really not that hard, and it just takes a minute to mix it by hand. The thing about using butter, if there happens to be a piece left that doesn't get mixed in good, and it's in the middle of the biscuit, it's not going to make it taste bad. If you used like Crisco or something, nobody wants to bite into a biscuit and get a big chunk of Crisco. And you could use Crisco or lard even in these for your fat instead of the butter, but I really prefer the butter. It's more natural than Crisco. If you don't mind dying young, you could even use margarine in them, but it will shorten your life, so I'd stick with the butter. Okay, that's mixed up pretty good. Now I want to add my honey to my buttermilk because I want to put all of my wet ingredients in the biscuits at the same time. Like I said, once I put the buttermilk in there, I don't want to work this any more than is absolutely necessary. And just kind of mix that up. You don't have to get it mixed up real great, but you don't want any huge drops of honey in your biscuits if you can help it. Okay, and just kind of pour this in the center of your flour and your butter. And stir it up. Well, this biscuit dough is definitely not too wet because our butter was soft. It's actually a tiny bit on the dry side, but it's not so dry that I'm going to add more milk to it, because at this point adding more milk to it means I'm going to have to stir it a lot more, and it'll make my biscuits tough, and I don't want to do that. When you roll your biscuits out, you can actually adjust how much moisture is in them a little bit. Like if our dough happened to be really wet and really sticky, and sometimes it happens that way, then you would want to flour the surface that you're rolling them out on really heavy. And I'm just using a piece of wax paper to roll these out. But because ours is kind of dry, I'm not going to put a whole lot of flour out here. Okay, now at this point I want to mash my dough together, and I'm just going to knead it a couple of times, like maybe 3 or 4 times, to get it all stuck together good. And when you knead it, it will put some layers in your biscuits if you like layered biscuits. And somebody had commented on my other videos, I don't remember who it was, and they were looking for a biscuit that really had a lot of layers in it. Well, they make those canned biscuits like that, and it's kind of hard to get that in a homemade biscuit. But if you really want a lot of layers, what you can do is you can roll your dough out thin, flour it, and then fold it over to about 3/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch thick, probably about 1/2 inch thick if you're going to do that, and cut it out, and then you will have all of those layers in your biscuits. Okay, that's about all the kneading I'm going to do. And I'm not going to roll this, I'm just going to press it out until it's a little more than 1/2 inch thick. And you put them in your pan. If you want thick biscuits, set the edges where they are almost touching. Not quite, but almost. Now that's a pretty thick biscuit there. You want to leave a little room for them to rise. But if they're almost touching, they'll rise up high and they won't fall over. Okay, I'm going to have to fold this up and squish it out again to get more biscuits out of it. And there are some people who won't do this to their dough, but I think that's silly and wasteful. You're not going to be able to tell that much difference in the dough of the biscuits that you squished up and cut out again. Toward the end of last year, I don't know, maybe it was a little bit before Thanksgiving, Samantha started really challenging all of us to start reading the Bible at Genesis and read it through. Now, I got saved when I was 24, and I've done a lot of Bible studies, and I've started reading the Bible in Genesis many, many times and never made it past Genesis. It's a confession of the day. But since she started really challenging everybody to read starting in Genesis, I did start, I don't know, a little bit after Thanksgiving, I guess, and I'm proud to say I have made it out of Genesis. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, and I do not have room in my pan for the rest of these, but now if you want them to rise up, you want them in your pan about like this, like I said, not quite touching, and these will get really, really thick. You can brush a lot of stuff on them. You could brush them with a little buttermilk, you could brush them with a little butter, but I don't like to put anything on mine until after they've baked, and then we're going to put some butter on them. So we'll put these in as soon as that oven gets done preheated. But anyway, like I said, the reason I'm bringing up starting to read the Bible in Genesis and reading it through is because if you have been saved for a while, or if you're looking for some answers, if you start reading the Bible in Genesis, you really do get to know God as you go through it. And that's what's stricken me more than anything, is that you really get to know God when you start reading the Bible in Genesis. Now, if you're not saved, don't start reading the Bible in Genesis. You have to start in the New Testament, because you have to get to know Jesus Christ before you can know God. Jesus said, "No man comes to the Father but through me." So get to know Jesus, find out who He is, seek His forgiveness, then go back to Genesis. And I strongly suggest, if you're not saved, to find yourself a Christian friend who can help lead you through that process and help you get to know Jesus. Because if you start reading the Bible, somewhere in there you are going to find the answer to every problem you could possibly have in life. God doesn't give us a problem that He doesn't give us the answer for. And one of the problems that has come up, not just I guess in my life or mine and Brett's life, of course we have had our share of money problems, but it seems like over the past 2 or 3 weeks there have been several people that are close to us that have had really bad money problems. And there are also people in our life who are prospering beyond belief, even in these very tough economic times. So we decided to look at what was going on in those people's lives and see what was different, and look at how God feels about money, I guess, and how He provides for us. And the conclusion that we came to is those people who are prospering in these tough economic times, first, they recognize that their money comes from God. It doesn't matter if it's something that was inherited and fell out of the sky, whatever, or if it was a paycheck that they earned, if it was a gift for a birthday, if they got a really good deal on something, or if they sold something and they made a profit on it, all that money comes from God. Now, when you recognize the fact that everything you have comes from God, even if it's not a monetary thing, if somebody gave you something that is valuable, that increases your wealth. And recognizing that those things come from God and that He is providing for you is a huge key to financial success, I guess. Once you acknowledge Him as your provider, He is more willing to provide in abundance. And the Bible says that God wants us to have an abundant life. And the other thing is, the other secret to financial success is giving to God. And there's a 10% rule that most people believe is hard and fast, and it's taught in churches. You tithe the 10%. That 10% is all through the Bible in different places, but there are also other things in there, and especially in the New Testament, especially now that Jesus came, grace kind of changed things. But that 10% rule is a good place to start. I don't want to tell you not to tithe, because I think you should tithe, and I think that 10% is where you should start. But what God wants, if you read the Bible, if you go through the Bible and you look at the offerings that God was asking for and the sacrifices that God was asking for, He was asking for the best, the first, that was perfect and without blemish. Now, He asked for animals to be offered. He asked for grain offerings. He asked for wine offerings. He asked for incense offerings, all kinds of things, and also monetary offerings. But what He wants is that we don't want to give up. Because when we give up what we don't want to give, we're giving it in faith, believing that what He is going to give us back is better. And that's what God does. When you give something, He blesses you with something far better. But it takes faith to give up what you have without being able to see what's better. So that realization and that acknowledgement, when you get to that point where you acknowledge that everything you have comes from God, that He is providing for you, and when you come to that point where you can give up the best, the first, the perfect, what you don't want to give up, in faith that God is going to bless it and give you something much better in return. That truly is the key to financial success and financial happiness. It's the key to wealth and abundance. And it may not be that your bank account is ever going to have $10 million in it or $100 million in it or whatever. Your bank account may never have $100 in it. But when you learn to live by those principles and give God what He wants, the best, the perfect, the first, the stuff that you hold dear, and you acknowledge that He is your provider, you will have everything you need. You will start to find that those things that you want, your heart's desires, you have those. And it may not be that you're able to go out and purchase them, but maybe somebody will say, hey, I got an extra whatever it is that you have been wanting for the past 20 years and haven't been able to buy it. Or maybe for your birthday, somebody will show up with something that you've been wanting for a long, long time and just have not had the money to purchase it. God really does do stuff like that. Test Him. Give it to Him in faith. Believe Him and trust Him and see if it doesn't work. Okay, there's our timer. Alright, so we're going to put these in here for about 15 minutes. Now these are kind of big, and I did make them really thick, so it might take just a little bit longer than that. After about 12 minutes, you want to kind of keep an eye on them because your oven may be different than mine. But we'll pull them out here in a minute and take a look at them. Okay, I have my biscuits in the oven for about 18 minutes because, like I said, these are thick and they are pretty big around. And you want to leave them in there until the tops start to brown. If the tops aren't starting to brown yet, your biscuits aren't done. And you can see here our tops are all nice and golden brown. They did rise up really thick. And like I said, I like to put butter on the top of mine when I take them out of the oven. If you brush them with something before you bake them, they don't really get brown. Or they don't get as brown, I don't think. Something else too, if you have bought buttermilk to cook something with, like I recently bought a pretty big jar of buttermilk because I wanted to make some buttermilk pie and record that video for y'all. Buttermilk is kind of expensive. I mean, if you buy it, you know that. I don't keep it all the time because it is expensive. So when you buy it for a pie or something, go ahead and make a batch of buttermilk biscuits or some buttermilk cornbread and things like that and use it all up. I mean, you don't want it to go to waste because, like I said, it's expensive. Thanks for joining us in the Hillbilly Kitchen. Don't forget to click like and subscribe before you leave, and we'll see you next time.